All right, government students, here is lesson 2 of unit 1 as we start to look at kind of the basis of government and how our government was formed. And today we're going to be looking at a lot of the different forms of government. So this isn't going to be the most exciting of things because we're pretty much going to be looking at definitions. But this is super, super important to understand these definitions so you begin to look at not just how our government functions, but how other governments around the world function, and for a lot of the things that we'll be doing in class uh, next time. All right. So, forms of government. What are the different types of governments, and how do all these different types of things function? When it comes to all these different forms of government, there's like most governments are made up of multiple forms. Okay, there are multiple elements that are combined together to create a working government. You have similarities between different governments, and you have a lot of differences. So, to help you kind of understand what one particular nation's government is, there's a couple questions you can ask to try and figure things out as we go. All right. First of all, does the government have limited or unlimited power? All right. Can the government do what it wants whenever? All right. Like a dictatorship, go to Kim Jong Un over in North Korea, or is it limited in some way? Are there limits about what government can do? Okay. That's a really important question. Based off of that, you have different forms of government that are going to start showing up. Okay. Next up, you want to look at who has the power. Right? Is it one person? Is it a small group of people? Maybe it's one political party that has all the power. Do the people have the ultimate authority? Right? We're going back to popular sovereignty that we talked about last time. Who has the power in that government? Okay. Thirdly, um, how is that power distributed geographically? Right. So if you were to put the basis of power for a country on a map, right? What does that look like? Is it centered in one particular location, right? And that one location has all the power, and really there's nothing, no other decisions are being made elsewhere? Is it kind of evenly divided up amongst different places, or is it really like centralized in a lot of locations with very limited central control? We'll look at some examples of that here in a little bit. And then lastly, when it comes to democracies, when it comes to situations where you have people representing the people, how is executive power distributed? How does they decide who's going to enforce the law in a lot of these different types of democracies? Okay, and again, all active governments are going to be a combination of that. For example, good old Canada to the north there, right? Canada is a representative democracy with limited power, but it also has a king and queen ruling over it. I don't know if you knew that, right? Queen Elizabeth II is still technically Queen of Canada, even though she doesn't have any real decision-making power. Okay, so limited or unlimited power. There's two different types of governments here when it comes to this. So make sure you get these definitions down. All right, you have an authoritarian government. That's where the government has absolutely total control. They have unlimited power, and whoever has that power, they are in charge. They say jump, you say how high, right? They are the ones who are making the decisions. A lot of times we tend to think of dictatorships being the most prominent example of that. A lot more common in today's world are constitutional governments, right? These are governments with limited power. And there is usually a written constitution. Okay, U.S. Constitution is an example of this, in which it lays out the ways in which government power is limited. It says, government, you can do these things. Okay, that's one way to limit it. Limit power is saying you can do these things. And it also prohibits the government from doing certain things. Okay, government, you may not do these things. A lot of times, a constitution will also include a Bill of Rights, right? So, like, we tend to think of like a lot of our freedoms: freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, petition, your right to bear arms. Okay, all of those types of things are included in our Bill of Rights. Those are ways in which government power is limited as well. Okay, because we have the right to speak our minds about government, even if the government doesn't like it. So those are example of constitutional governments. When it comes to authoritarian style of government, so let's say on that question you said, is it limited or unlimited power? You said the government has unlimited power. Okay, there are a couple of different types that can look at those governments can look like. Okay, the first is what's called an autocracy. Right? This is where one person is the leader, and they are the ones who are in charge. Right, here we go. Kim Jong Un. Look at how happy all these soldiers are. They are just so excited that Kim Jong Un is their presence. You know, in the Olympics a couple years ago, the North Koreans were like at the Olympics for the very first time, and they had it was the Winter Olympics, and they had like a group of these women Olympic competitors who were all together. They were like this like in sync cheer, and it was like really really impressive. And they were all smiling and clapping and all excited about representing their country. Do you really think they were that way? Well, no. They had to do that. They had to put on that show because if they didn't, Kim Jong Un would just show it. Have his military show up and take care of their families, right? And maybe some of their family members would just disappear if they didn't do those types of things. Again, that's a kind of an example of that force theory of government. Okay, so autocracy is ruled by a single leader, and again, that person is not elected. We a lot of times refer to these as dictatorships. You could also have an oligarchy, right? An oligarchy is ruled by a small group of society's elites. Most of the time, these occur in authoritarian governments. There are some situations where it have could show up in like a representative government, where like only part of society is able to vote, right? Like maybe a particular group of people, a large like the majority of the population isn't able to vote for some reason. We'll look at some examples of that in class. But oligarchies tend to be authoritarian style of government. And then you have monarchies, right? Especially absolute monarchies, where you have a king or a king ruling, and they're the ones who are making all the decisions. The whole divine right of kings theory. Okay. Under constitutional governments, you have two really different types of governments. You have a direct democracy and you have a representative democracy. Right? In a direct democracy, the people are making all the decisions all the time. Right? You are voting on every single decision. And as a result of that, man, direct democracies are just incredibly inefficient. They do not make decisions very quickly because when you get such a large group of people together to make a decision on something that's important, it takes forever. I mean, you look at even just Congress. Congress in itself is very slow, and that's our representatives. In the House you have 435 members, in the Senate you have 100. They take forever, it seems like sometimes, to make a decision on something. Now expand that further. Let's say the state of Michigan. The state of Michigan's going to make a decision on every little thing. What road is going to get fixed, right? Because Michigan roads are so good and they need a ton of work, right? So there's a bridge over in Detroit that needs to get fixed because concrete is falling on cars below and stuff like that. But all the people in West Michigan say, well, why do I want to use my tax dollars, the money that I'm paying out of my paycheck, to go fix a road in Detroit that I'm never going to see? So all of a sudden you start to debate that and say, well, if you're going to use money to fix that road, why aren't we fixing my road over here? And you start to have all these debates that start coming up. And this is where direct democracies get really, really inefficient, is they're making all the decisions everywhere. Okay? So what tends to happen is most governments here in the world are going to be representative democracies or republics, where we elect people to represent us, okay, and to make the decisions for us. If we don't like the decisions that they're making, next time elections come around, we choose somebody else. Okay? But the representatives are the ones who are making all of those decisions. Okay? Within a constitutional government, within a representative democracy, you have to have somebody who's in charge. You have to have a chief executive. And how we go about choosing that chief executive depends or creates two different, really two different styles of government. You have what we're more familiar with, a presidential system, where the voters choose who that chief executive is. They vote directly on who that executive is. And they are also choosing who those representatives are in the legislature, right, and the lawmaking body. So I could vote for a Republican over here in the legislative branch, and I could also vote for a Democrat over here. That's okay. I could vote for a Republican in the legislative branch and a Republican chief executive. I could vote for a Democrat over here in the legislative branch and a Republican over here. Like, these two choices are not connected. Okay? These people have no real influence over who the chief executive is, who's the guy who's going to be enforcing the law. Okay, that is a presidential system. Okay? That is a presidential system. What the other option is what's called a parliamentary system. And in this system, okay, the voters vote and elect the legislature. Okay? That legislature then gets together and says, okay, who within our group of people, who within this legislature is going to be in charge of enforcing all the law? Okay? And they select the chief executive. Okay? Usually this is called a prime minister. Okay? A prime minister. So Canada, for example, uses this particular method, a parliamentary. So does Britain. And the voters choose the representatives, okay, and the representatives choose the chief executive. The voters do not get a choice in who the chief executive is. They're not the ones who are making that decision. Okay? It is the legislature who is selecting the chief executive, and this is probably the most commonly missed and like misunderstood one for whatever reason for students. So really make sure you understand presidential, voters choose the chief executive. In a parliamentary, it's the legislative branch, the representatives who are choosing the chief executive. Okay. Uh, Remember, I talked about geographic forms of government. You have three different types. You have a unitary government here. So how does government look on a map? Where is that power located? In a unitary system, that's where it is all centrally located. It's one place that is making all of the decisions. Okay? The exact opposite of that would be a confederacy, okay? Where you have a bunch of states that are making all the decisions and a loosely organized national government that doesn't really have a whole lot of power. They don't have the ability to make a whole lot of decisions. The vast majority of decisions are going to be made by the states. And in between those two, you have what's called a federal government. Okay? And in a federal government, the states still have a lot of power. The states are still able to make a lot of decisions, but the national government has significant more power than what you're going to get in a confederacy, right? And this, you're getting a tug of war a lot of times between national and state governments over some issues where they're both vying for power and vying for decision making in some of those different areas, right? So those are the definitions for it. Pause it if you need to get those down, but I'm going to go show you on a map because I think that helps a lot, all right? So here's an infographic that's kind of basically telling you the same kind of thing here. We'll come back and we'll look at that later too. Okay, but in a unitary system, right? This is a great example. England is a unitary system. London makes all the decisions. You have Northern Ireland in the UK. You have Scotland. You have England and Wales. All of these four states essentially make up the United Kingdom. But Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, right? England, they're not really making any individual decisions that affect just them. If Northern Ireland could have their way, they might even be a part of Ireland. They might get away from the UK, but they don't have that ability to make that decision. Okay? Because all the power is centrally located here in the capital, London. All right? In a confederacy, the most great example of this would be the European Union, where all of these individual states are the ones who are making the decisions. All these states, all these countries are making their own decisions. A decision made in France is not going to affect a decision made in Spain, right? Or in Germany, or in Italy, or in Hungary, or all these different places. Okay? This is really the only example I can think of a modern day confederacy. Okay? Because there is a loose alliance, okay, a very loose alliance between all these different countries where they've agreed to work together in certain areas, right? You don't need a passport to go between France and Spain, or France and Germany, or France and Italy, or any of these European Union countries. You don't need a passport, even though you're crossing country borders, because they've agreed that you don't need that anymore. That's one of the conditions that they have as a kind of a national government, if you want to look at that way, or international government. They also, a lot of these countries all use the euro as a common currency. So you don't have to exchange money as often when you're moving from place to place, right, to be more competitive. But really, Brussels over here in Belgium, they're not making a whole lot of decisions that are going to impact everybody. It's a very loose alliance, and as England did a country doesn't like what the European Union is doing, they can leave, right? The whole Brexit thing that ended where England, or sorry, the United Kingdom left last year. Yeah, so that's a confederacy. What we have is a federal style. And I think with the whole coronavirus pandemic, you've seen a federal style play itself out more readily than I've seen in probably a long time, where you see the states and the national government both vying for power, right? Decisions that are made being down in Florida, okay, are not going to be necessarily the same decisions that are made up in Michigan or South Dakota or California. And a lot of this, like a federal style, works really, really well because in a confederacy, if you ask somebody from these different states, well, I'm French, I'm German, I'm Swedish. From here, we all consider ourselves to be Americans, even though I think we can all agree, right? Michigan, very, very different than California. Texas, very, very different than Wyoming in terms of culture, in terms of the values of that particular population, right? In terms of the types of things that matter to those populations and the things that are important there. So each one of these different states, and all 50 of them here, are able to make their own decisions to try and benefit their people. But at the same time, Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, right, our national government, makes a lot of decisions that also impact all 50 states. So you have this balance between national power and state power. Okay. Last slide here. A couple other things to know. A couple of forms of government you need to know. Theocracies. Okay. This is where a legal system where the state is based on religious law. A great example of this is Vatican City. All right, I don't know if you know this, but inside Rome is Vatican City, really, really small. And within Vatican City, the Pope is the ultimate authority. Like, decisions made by Italy's government do not impact Vatican City. It is its own little government. And it is a true theocracy where the entire legal system is built on what the Pope says and what the Bible says. Another real common example of this, and we're starting to see this in the Islamic world, is Sharia law. Okay, very, very common in the Islamic world. You also have socialism, right? Socialism is where you have communal ownership of some of the means of production, right? And this is starting to get into economics a little bit more, right? But you have some communal ownership. And we have examples of socialism in the United States. Okay? A really common example that you're benefiting from right now is public education. Okay? You have communal ownership of that. Right? You are paying taxes, and the government is providing a communal service for the entire community. So the socialism is one form of government. You also have a military junta. All right, a military junta is where you have really the government is led by the military. This is pretty common more in Africa because it's a very unstable region thanks to European colonialism. Yeah, and kind of how Europeans left Africa and just basically let nations kind of fight it out for themselves. You tend to see a lot of military juntas in there. ISIS would probably be another example of that, where they're trying to control by military force. And then lastly, you have anarchy. Okay, anarchy is the absence of government. There's no government. People have absolute freedom, and it's pretty chaotic. Think the purge, right? With that. So those are the different forms of government. Have those ready to go for next class. We will be using these, and you may want to know these definitions because if you're paying attention to this, there may be a little quiz to start off class with. So make sure you know these forms of government going into class. All right. I'll see you then.